Okay, so this is the third video lecture on the chapter of race and ethnicity. The last video lecture, I was talking about ethnicity and ancestry, and in this one, I'm going to talk about some of the terms about intergroup relationships. So sometimes you'll hear these different, you'll hear these different terms, minority group, and dominant and and subordinate group. The key thing to remember about these terms is they are different. They mean different things from a sociological perspective than, say, they do if you were in a math class. In a math class, we might refer to minority as the smaller number, but sociologically, when we use the term minority in a social context, we're referring to the group that has less power. So the key here, and it probably should be bolded, the key here is this term is that these terms refer to one's relative power. So a minority group may numerically be the majority, but it is the group that has less power. A really great example is in American history during slave times, as there was at some points in history there were like 3 times as many slaves as there were free people, but they were still considered a minority group because they didn't have any power. So in order to kind of keep this to keep this distinction, you may also hear the term dominant versus subordinate. So obviously the dominant group is the one that has more power. The subordinate group is the group that has less power. The reason these terms are important is because, or one of the consequences of these terms is our attitude towards them. So prejudice, and this is an important distinction, prejudice and discrimination are kind of like paired concepts, is an idea. To take that word apart, you have to prejudge. So prejudice is an attitude. It is an attitude about, you can be prejudiced about anything. You might hear it referred to as bias. I should have looked up the difference between bias versus prejudice. I mean, bias is a kind of prejudice. We talk about having both positive and negative prejudices. So positive is where you interpret or you assume something. So like I recently actually heard this is not a good one, but sometimes when we talk about positive prejudices, is the idea that Asian students are better at math, which used to be the one I used to use as an example. But I read an article not very long ago and was talking about how that's really a very bad prejudice to have because it holds Asian students up to an unreasonable standard, and it overlooks the possibility that they may really be struggling in math. So you have an Asian student in your teacher, you have an Asian student in your math class, you don't even bother to check in with them if they're struggling because you have the positive impression, their positive bias that they're good at math. And so they fall behind because you don't treat them the same as you do others. Another negative consequence of this so-called positive prejudice is if they are not performing well on their math, then they get shamed or discredited or judged by other Asians who are good at math, right? Because you're not living up to what's expected of you. I think your textbook talks about an example, say, where African black students are really good students, right? While that's a good thing, because that is not what the bias or not what the prejudicial stereotype is, then they are judged by other people. So stereotypes refer to an overgeneralization of differences, right? So one time I heard the idea that stereotypes are like there's a kernel of truth, like they begin somewhere. This idea, say that, I'm trying to think of a stereotype that's not too stereotypical. The idea that women like to shop, right? So maybe somewhere among some group that there's some truth to that. There's some truth that women like to shop. A lot of women do like to shop. But when we overgeneralize the stereotype and assume that all women, when you meet a woman and you assume she likes to shop and you treat her that way and you don't see her for anything other than that stereotype, then that stereotype actually harms her because you have assumed, this is a better one. Actually, this is one from my own lived experience, is that women know how to cook, right? In my house, I don't do any cooking. My husband does all the cooking, and I'm middle-aged and I don't know how to cook. And so when we would go on service trips with my church, for instance, and the women would always get assigned kitchen duties, and I'm in the kitchen because I'm a woman, and they would tell me to do things in the kitchen and I don't know how to do them. And they wouldn't believe me, right? They would make fun of me. They would tease me. Like, what do you mean you don't know how to do this? Because the stereotype is I know how to cook. And when I don't conform to that stereotype, then I'm judged. And I'm also not given opportunities to go outside and do the things with the men that I probably know how to do. The culture of prejudice is when these prejudicial ideas are embedded in our culture and we don't even notice them. The textbook, this OpenStax textbook, makes a reference to, like, if you go to the grocery store, I don't even know if this is still a thing, but it used to be like you'd get maple syrup or syrup for your pancakes with Aunt Jemima on it, right? Or who was another one? There was another breakfast food, and it was the image of a black man. And then growing up, there were certain restaurants, and they all had these stereotypical notions. I'm trying to think of some other good ones. And these are very prejudicial. They're potentially demeaning. They narrow a person or a group of people. Matter of fact, I think there's even some reference to be an Aunt Jemima. I'm not entirely sure what that means. I may have just insulted somebody because I don't know what it means. But that's this idea of a culture of prejudice. I think these pearls should probably be scooted over. These other ideas about prejudice and discrimination. One way to think about prejudice is these are beliefs about a group of people that come from outside of our experiences. So there's a theory in anti-racism literature and actually social psychology and sociology, and it's called contact theory. And what contact theory says is that the more contact you have with a group of people, the less you will embrace the stereotypes and potentially the less prejudice you will be to them, because, well, obviously, the more real experiences you have, the more you realize those are overgeneralizations. So the idea, I think that what this phrase refers to outside of our experiences is that prejudices are beliefs about a group that are outside of our lived experiences. So if you have never interacted with, or you don't have extensive interaction with a particular group, you're going to believe the little bit of information that you have. I remember reading, or there was this notion that racism is like a virus, like it's in the air. Our whole culture is that, well, that's where it is right there, the whole culture of prejudice, that our whole culture sends us messages about groups of people. It sends us messages about women, about black people, about rich people, and we have no choice. We have to breathe the air. So we're breathing in these prejudicial and these racist and these sexist and these classist ideas because that's the only air there is. So it becomes our responsibility then to unlearn them and to find some fresh air. Confirmation bias is what happens when we have heard this limited amount of information. We've learned that Asian students are really good at math, right? But we don't have any Asian friends. Well, we meet one Asian friend and look at that, he's really good at math. So we say, well, that must be true, right? And that's what we mean by a confirmation bias. Or we have heard that, say, black children are more likely to have fathers who are incarcerated, which is actually a true statistic. And we meet a person and lo and behold, their father's incarcerated. And we go, oh, see, that's true. That must be true. It must be true for everybody. Well, that's when it becomes a stereotype, and that's when it becomes bad, is when we assume this pattern applies to everybody. I only made it through 2 slides. I'm going to stop right here because 1 minute is not enough for me to explain this idea.